Empress Wu Zetian. Empress Wu Zetian was the only woman to ever rule China in her own name, and she didn't get there by handing out cupcakes and good vibes. There's ambition, and then there's I'm going to seduce the emperor, become empress, and then erase my own children from the board like I'm playing an extremely personal game of chess against myself. She allegedly smothered her own infant daughter to frame the sitting empress for murder, because in palace politics, sometimes you've just got to create your own vacancy. That's corporate ladder climbing, except the ladder is greased with blood. Wu wasn't just ruthless, she was brilliant. She built a spy network so vast and intimate it made Orwell's 1984 look like a low-budget high school play. Ministers would whisper secrets in their own bathrooms, convinced the walls were listening, and they probably were. She promoted meritocracy over aristocracy, which sounds noble until you realize that merit was defined as how useful are you to me before I find a better pawn. Her reign was drenched in propaganda. She ordered the creation of new Chinese characters to glorify herself. Imagine renaming the alphabet so every sentence praises you by accident. That's not insecurity. That's artistry in tyranny. And yet, the irony, her time on the throne was stable, prosperous, culturally rich. She was a monster, yes, but a competent one, which is somehow scarier, because chaos is exhausting, but an efficient villain? That's forever. King Ludwig II of Bavaria. King Ludwig II was a Bavarian monarch whose legacy is equal parts architectural fever dream and slow-motion mental breakdown. The man loved castles, not I have a nice hunting lodge castles, full-on fairy tale fortresses with towers sharp enough to skewer clouds. He bankrupted himself building them, obsessing over every turret and fresco like an interior decorator who'd been left unsupervised for decades. His favorite? Neuschwanstein, the Disney castle's goth, reclusive older brother. But Ludwig didn't care for ruling. Politics bored him. Reality irritated him. He preferred Wagnerian operas and avoiding people entirely. He was called the fairy tale king, not because he was whimsical, but because he existed in a private fantasy realm, dragging Bavaria's treasury with him. Ministers whispered that he was mad. Maybe he was, but if madness is wanting to escape the petty backstabbing of politics for glittering palaces in the mountains, I suspect half the planet is quietly insane. His end was as strange as his reign. Declared mentally unfit without examination, deposed, and found dead 2 days later in a shallow lake alongside his psychiatrist. No witnesses, no explanation, just a king and his doctor, floating face down under a sky that probably looked like one of his murals. Was it suicide? Murder? A joint escape plan gone wrong? We'll never know. Bavaria got to keep the castles, though. In the end, that's the only part Ludwig probably cared about. Ivan VI of Russia. Ivan VI was crowned Emperor of Russia at the age of 2 months, which is impressive until you remember that newborns can't hold their heads up, let alone a crown. His reign lasted barely a year before Empress Elizabeth staged a coup, locking him away in solitary confinement so complete that most of Russia forgot he even existed. Imagine your entire life being a prison sentence for the crime of being born in the wrong dynasty. He grew up without sunlight, without conversation, without books. His brain starved as much as his body. The guards were forbidden to mention his name, as if language itself could keep him from being real. He was a Schrodinger's czar, existing only in official paranoia. By the time anyone saw him again, he was 23, pale as candle wax, eyes like someone who'd stared at too many blank walls. When Catherine the Great came to power, she kept him locked away as a political liability. The final twist. In 1764, an officer tried to free him. The guards, under orders, killed him instantly. That's it. No speeches, no scandal trial, just stab, stab, problem erased. His entire life was a ghost story while he was still alive. And the moral? In royal politics, you don't have to lose the game to be destroyed. Sometimes you're just born as someone else's threat, and that's enough to make you disappear. Charles II of Spain. Charles II was the last Habsburg ruler of Spain, and his family tree looked less like a branching oak and more like a pretzel someone dropped in a fire. The inbreeding was so extreme that Charles had one of the lowest inbreeding coefficients ever recorded in a royal. Basically, his genetic code was holding itself together with duct tape and prayer. The poor man was born physically weak, chronically ill, partially paralyzed, and unable to chew food properly. His jaw was so oversized, thanks centuries of cousin marriage, that portraits couldn't even hide it without the painter just giving up. Politically, his reign was a disaster. Spain's empire was collapsing, treasury empty, morale in free fall, and Charles, kind, timid, and utterly incapable of producing an heir, was like a tragic child king who never grew into the role. He was obsessed with the occult, convinced his health issues were due to witchcraft, and reportedly had priests perform exorcisms on him while still alive. Imagine being so unlucky that you live in a palace, wear gold-threaded clothes, and still feel like you're starring in The Exorcist. When he finally died in 1700, the autopsy read like body horror fanfiction. His heart was the size of a peppercorn, his lungs corroded, his intestines rotten, his head full of water, and yet his death triggered the War of the Spanish Succession. So even in death, he managed to cause a global conflict. It's the kind of royal life that makes you think maybe the fairy tale about marrying princes left out the genetic fine print for a reason. Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary was a queen 3 times over, a widow at 18, and possibly the unluckiest political gambler in European history. She became Queen of Scotland while still a baby, married the French Dauphin, future king, at 15, became Queen of France for about 5 minutes, and then, poof, her husband died. She returned to Scotland, only to marry a man so awful, her nobles probably drafted his most punchable faces in Scotland award certificate. His suspicious murder led her to marry his likely killer. Royal dating pool problems, right? The Scottish nobility revolted, threw her in prison, and forced her to abdicate in favor of her infant son. She fled to England seeking protection from her cousin, Elizabeth West, who promptly kept her locked up for 19 years. This wasn't a cushy, Netflix in bed kind of captivity. It was a slow-motion execution. Elizabeth saw Mary as a living threat, a Catholic with a strong claim to the English throne. And sure enough, Mary's name kept popping up in plots to overthrow Elizabeth. When one plot finally stuck, Elizabeth signed her death warrant. Mary met the executioner in 1587 wearing a crimson gown, the Catholic color of martyrdom, under her black dress. It took 3 swings of the axe to finish the job, and when her head finally rolled, her little dog came crawling out from under her skirts, covered in her blood. That's not just history. That's a Shakespearean stage direction someone forgot to tone down for real life. George III of the United Kingdom. George III is most famous in American textbooks for being the guy we declared independence from, but in Britain, his legend is tangled up with madness, family dysfunction, and a nation unsure whether to pity or fear him. He started strong, dutiful, moral, hardworking, but in his later years, he suffered terrifying bouts of mental illness, likely caused by a genetic metabolic disorder called porphyria. His speech would become manic, his words tumbling out so fast they dissolved into nonsense. He'd talk for hours without pause, foaming at the mouth, eyes rolling. At his worst, he claimed to speak to angels. At his best, he was lucid but deeply paranoid. The tragedy was public. Newspapers printed rumors about the Mad King, Parliament debated removing him, and his own son schemed to take over as regent. Imagine losing your grip on reality while also being the most visible person in the country, and knowing every breakdown will be recorded for posterity. Yet George wasn't some frothing caricature. In lucid periods, he loved science, agriculture, and genuinely trying to improve his kingdom. He was deeply moral, almost prudish, and took pride in being a faithful husband, practically a royal anomaly. But his final decade was pure darkness. Blind, deaf, insane, and locked away at Windsor Castle, listening to the echo of a country that had already moved on without him. History often remembers his illness as a punchline, but read closely, and it's a slow, heartbreaking unraveling of a man who once ruled an empire. Princess Qajar. Princess Qajar was a Persian royal in the late 19th century who is remembered less for her political life and more for the sheer gravitational pull of her unconventional beauty. In Qajar, Persia, thick eyebrows that met in the middle and a faint mustache on a woman were not just tolerated, they were considered alluring. Princess Qajar was a fashion icon of the era, inspiring poetry, love letters, and at least 13 known marriage proposals from noblemen, all of whom she rejected. The part the internet loves to exaggerate, allegedly multiple suitors committed suicide over her refusal, is historically murky, but the obsession was real. She wasn't just a face in a portrait. She was educated, witty, politically engaged, and moved in the highest intellectual circles. But step outside her time period, and Western observers, accustomed to Victorian beauty standards, wrote about her like she'd just emerged from a surrealist painting, which is the point. Beauty is not eternal. It's a currency with an expiration date and wildly changing exchange rates. In 1890, Tehran, she was a diamond. In 1890, London, she'd be mocked in satirical papers. Same woman, same face. What's fascinating is the way her image gets memeified today. People slap her portrait online, call her the ultimate heartbreak machine, and turn her into clickbait without realizing they're reenacting the same cultural game, assigning value, mocking, worshipping, distorting. The mustache is still famous, but the fact she spoke multiple languages and navigated court politics with precision buried in the footnotes, which feels like the cruelest royal fate of all, to be remembered, but only as a face, not as a person.